man stands at the edge of a rail yard at dusk, a briefcase in one hand. Inside it, a kitchen knife, a length of rope, a jar of petroleum jelly, and a folded child's glove. 12 years earlier, a detective closed this exact case. A man confessed. A man was executed. The file was stamped, filed, forgotten. Everyone involved moved on with their lives, certain that justice, however quickly it arrived, had arrived correctly. But the killing never stopped. It simply continued, patiently, for over a decade, under a name no file had ever recorded. Tonight, an ordinary patrolman is about to stop an ordinary-looking man for doing nothing more than walking oddly close to a stranger near Platform 6. He has no idea he is about to end the longest manhunt in Soviet history. A hunt for someone the state had already insisted, on principle, could not exist. This is the story of how a system that could not admit to the idea of a monster let one operate, in plain sight, for over a decade. Our story begins in a cramped industrial town in the Soviet South. Coal dust in the air, gray apartment blocks, a rail line running through the middle of everything like a spine. It is the winter of 1978. Grigor Orlov is, by every visible measure, unremarkable. 42 years old, a former schoolteacher, recently moved into a clerical job that requires him to travel for supply runs. Married, 2 children, a Communist Party card in his coat pocket. Neighbors describe him as quiet, a little awkward, easy to overlook. What they don't know is that Orlov has spent years fighting, and losing, a private war with himself. As a teacher, he'd been quietly pushed out of 2 different schools after parents complained about how he behaved around their children. No formal charges were filed. In the Soviet system, an ugly rumor was handled by quietly transferring the problem elsewhere, not by confronting it. So the problem moved. And metastasized. On a December evening, 9-year-old Nina Zabatina is walking home when a man she doesn't know falls into step beside her. He is polite, unthreatening. He mentions a house nearby, says there might be something there she'd like to see. She goes with him. 2 days later, her body is found near the riverbank. She has been stabbed multiple times. The town wants an answer immediately, and the local police are under enormous pressure to provide one. Within days, they arrest a 25-year-old man from the neighborhood, Pavel Krivenko, who has a prior conviction and, crucially, no one of consequence willing to fight for him. He has an alibi. Witnesses initially back him up. It doesn't matter. Under interrogation methods, the Soviet system rarely allowed anyone to scrutinize. Krivenko confesses. He recants almost immediately, says the confession was beaten and threatened out of him. It doesn't matter. The victim's family wants closure. The regional prosecutors want a closed file. Krivenko is convicted. Here is the detail that will haunt this story for the next 12 years. The case is closed. On paper, the man who killed Nina Zabatina is already behind bars. He isn't. Grigor Orlov goes back to his life, to his job, his marriage, his commute. His wife knows him as an anxious, physically distant husband. Their marriage has for years revolved around an intimacy problem neither of them speaks about openly, something Orlov has quietly carried as a private humiliation since his 20s. Colleagues at the supply depot know him as punctual, a little colorless, easy to forget the moment he leaves a room. Something in him, something he later claims he could not fully explain even to himself, has changed. He will tell investigators years later that this first act of violence unlocked something he had never been able to satisfy any other way. Something no ordinary part of his life had ever come close to giving him. He begins to travel more for work, requesting routes that take him through smaller towns and unfamiliar stations. He begins to notice train platforms differently, not as places to pass through, but as places full of runaways, drifters, and children unsupervised for just long enough. For a while he resists. He will later describe, almost proudly, entire business trips cut short. A sudden, urgent excuse invented to his supervisor, a train ticket bought home a day early, specifically so he would not be near a station, near an opportunity, near the version of himself he was most afraid of. It never lasts. 3 years pass in official silence. The file on Nina Zabatina long closed, her killer's name never once entered into any register. Then the bodies start again. By 1982, bodies are turning up with a regularity too consistent to be coincidence. In wooded strips of land locals call the forest belt, running alongside the rail corridors outside town. A 13-year-old girl, sent to run an errand, never comes home. A 17-year-old boy vanishes after an evening at a train platform. The pattern is horribly consistent. Isolated wooded areas, victims taken from stations or bus stops, injuries far more severe than any single act of self-defense or robbery could explain. Local investigators begin to suspect they are looking for one person. This is, in itself, a radical thought within the Soviet system. Officially, serial sexual murder is treated as a decadent Western phenomenon, a symptom of capitalism, not something that happens under socialism. Textbooks used in police academies at the time barely acknowledge the concept exists. Admitting a serial killer is operating here is not just a police failure. It's treated as close to a political one, an admission that something is rotten inside a society that isn't supposed to produce men like this at all. That pressure shapes everything about how the case is handled from here on. Reports are kept out of the regional newspapers. Parents in the affected districts are warned informally, through schools and workplaces, to keep children close to home after dark. But no public statement ever uses the words serial killer. The rumor that fills the silence is, in its own way, almost as frightening as the truth. Townspeople begin whispering about a wolfman, a monster from the old stories. Something supernatural rather than a man who rides the same trains they do. A young forensic analyst named Novikov is the first to formally connect several of the killings through pattern analysis. Same wound types, same general age range and vulnerability profile of victims, same geography along the rail line. He takes his findings to his superior, Colonel Rudenko, who reluctantly agrees to quietly form a task force. It is given a bland, deliberately unthreatening internal name, so as not to alarm anyone above them. Operation Forest Path. The team is small, the resources are limited, and they are hunting a man who, by daylight, could be anyone standing next to you on a train platform. Novikov spends weeks laying case files side by side on a table in an unused office, drawing connections no one had previously bothered to draw because the cases had originally been filed in different districts, months apart, by officers who had no reason to compare notes with each other. It is tedious, unglamorous work, the opposite of the dramatic breakthroughs true crime stories usually promise. But it's this quiet cross-referencing, more than any single flash of insight, that finally convinces Colonel Rudenko the department is facing something it has never faced before. Meanwhile, more bodies are found, and with each one, the profile the investigators are building grows both more specific and, frustratingly, more useless. They can describe what he does, they cannot say who he is. Then comes a break that feels like the answer. In 1984, officers pick up a man loitering suspiciously near a station, behaving oddly around a group of young women. He is questioned. His name is Grigor Orlov. A blood sample is taken as a matter of routine. At crime scenes, forensic teams have recovered biological evidence from several victims. Evidence that should, in theory, allow investigators to type the killer's blood group from bodily fluids left behind, using a method that assumes a person's blood type and their other bodily secretions will always match. Orlov's blood type doesn't match the killer's profile derived from the crime scenes. He is released. It will take investigators years to learn that a small percentage of the population, Orlov unknowingly among them, are what's known as non-secretors, people whose blood type cannot be reliably determined from other bodily fluids the way the standard test assumes. The one piece of hard science the task force trusted completely was wrong in exactly the way that mattered. The man they had for one afternoon in an interrogation room walks free, and the killings continue. The next several years unfold as a grinding, demoralizing cycle for Operation Forest Path. More victims, more false leads. The task force detains dozens of men who fit some version of the profile. Vagrants, men with prior convictions, men simply unlucky enough to be seen near a crime scene. Under pressure to produce results, some interrogations cross lines that will later become a source of shame for the department. At least a few men, worn down by relentless questioning, take their own lives rather than continue enduring it. None of them were the killer. This is the second false resolution of our story. Not a wrongful execution this time, but a wrongful certainty, repeated over and over. Every suspect who isn't the killer is, in its own way, another dead end dressed up as progress. Some are held for weeks before being released without apology or explanation. In a system built around the idea that the state does not make this kind of mistake, admitting error is almost as costly, politically, as admitting the killer exists at all. So records of these wrongful detentions are kept vague, incomplete, scattered across different jurisdictions that rarely compare notes. The task force itself is starved of the basic tools a case like this would need in a Western investigation. There is no shared national database of unsolved violent crimes. Forensic science, particularly around genetic evidence, lags years behind what detectives in other countries are beginning to use. Investigators are, in a very real sense, hunting a modern predator with the equipment of an earlier era, and no permission to ask for better. One case, among many, stands out to Novikov long after the investigation ends. A drifter picked up near a station platform, fitting the rough physical profile, unable to account for his whereabouts on the night of one murder. He is held for questioning far longer than procedure allows. He has no family able to intervene, no lawyer pushing back. After days of relentless pressure, he begins to talk in the vague, agreeable way exhausted, frightened people sometimes do. Not quite confessing, but not quite denying either. It takes another body turning up while he is still in custody to finally clear him. He is released with no apology and no record correction. Novikov will later admit that he thinks about that man more than almost anyone else connected to the case. A life derailed for a crime he never committed, absorbed and forgotten inside a system too overwhelmed to notice its own collateral damage. Novikov, the forensic analyst, becomes almost obsessive about the case, to the point of personal cost. His marriage strains under the weight of the hours he devotes to a killer who seems to not exist on paper anywhere. He pushes, unsuccessfully at first, for outside expertise, specifically a psychiatric profile of the kind of man who might be capable of this. Eventually, Colonel Rudenko authorizes bringing in Dr. Bukansky, a psychiatrist willing to do something almost nobody in the Soviet system had done before: build a behavioral profile of an unknown offender based purely on the pattern of his crimes. Bukansky's profile is strange, specific, and, this becomes important later, largely correct. He describes a man in his late 30s to 50s, married, likely with children, outwardly conventional, sexually inadequate in conventional relationships, drawn to environments where he can select vulnerable strangers, a man who would appear completely unremarkable to everyone around him. Nobody in the department fully trusts psychiatry as an investigative tool. The profile is filed. It is not, at this stage, meaningfully acted on. Meanwhile, Orlov's job continues to give him exactly what he needs: constant travel, constant access to train stations across the region, and a wife and public life that make him look, on paper, like the least likely man in the world to be capable of what he's doing. He is by now a grandfather. He attends party meetings. He is, in every visible way, a model of exactly the kind of ordinary citizen the system insists could never be capable of this. He will later tell investigators that he sometimes fought the urge for months at a time, cutting business trips short, forcing himself home early, before eventually losing that fight again. Each time he tells himself it will be the last. Each time it isn't. By the late 1980s, the death toll has climbed well past 24. The political cost of officially acknowledging what's happening becomes harder to avoid. As the country enters a period of greater openness in the media, silence is no longer fully enforceable. The story starts cautiously to reach the public, not with full details, but enough that people in the region begin to understand. Someone very dangerous has been operating near their rail stations for a decade, and no one has caught him. Novikov and Rudenko change tactics. If they cannot identify the man, they will watch every train station in the region until they catch him in the act. Plainclothes officers are assigned to platforms. Hidden cameras are installed on select train cars. It is exhausting, expensive, and, for a long time, it produces nothing. Winter, the very end of the 1980s. The surveillance operation has been running for months, quietly burning through resources and patience. Officers stand for entire shifts on freezing platforms, tracking hundreds of ordinary commuters, filing reports on dozens of persons of interest who amount to nothing. Morale inside the task force is, by every account, close to collapse. More than one investigator privately begins to wonder if the killer has died, moved away, or simply stopped. Then, an officer on routine platform duty notices a man behaving strangely, standing near a young woman, watching her closely, then wiping his hands and face with a cloth before boarding a different train than the one he seemed to be heading for. Nothing about this on its own is a crime, but it's odd enough that the officer notes the man's description and follows procedure, logging it rather than acting on it directly. Weeks later, another body is found near a rail corridor, matching the pattern exactly. The task force cross-references months of platform observation logs against the geography and timing of the new killing. One name surfaces as having been seen more than once near stations shortly before victims disappeared: Grigor Orlov, the same man who was cleared years earlier on the strength of a blood test that, unknown to everyone involved, had never been capable of clearing him at all. This time, investigators don't rely on forensic shortcuts. They put him under quiet, sustained surveillance. They watch him for days. And in November, officers finally observe him engaging with a young woman near a station in a way that matches the pattern precisely enough to justify an arrest. Orlov is taken into custody. In his possession, a knife, rope, and petroleum jelly. The same grim kit he has apparently carried in some form for over a decade. To the officers who search his briefcase, the ordinariness of it is almost more disturbing than anything more dramatic would have been. No mask, no trophy box, nothing theatrical. Just a tradesman's tools, carried by a man who looked, to everyone around him, like exactly what his party card said he was. For days, he denies everything. He is, by every account, an experienced enough liar and a strange enough personality that a standard interrogation gets investigators nowhere. Rudenko makes an unconventional decision. He brings in Dr. Bukhansky, the same psychiatrist who built the offender profile years earlier, to simply sit and talk with Orlov, not as an interrogator, but almost as a confessor. It works in a way nobody expected. Orlov, flattered by the attention of a man genuinely trying to understand him rather than simply condemn him, begins to talk. And once he starts, he does not stop. Over the following days, Orlov confesses to dozens of murders, more than investigators had even formally connected to a single offender. He describes, in his own words, the compulsion that had driven him since that first night in the winter of 1978. Investigators are able to confirm many of the confessions using details only the true killer could have known, including the location of remains that had never been found. As Orlov's confessions are cross-checked against the record, investigators make a discovery that turns the case from a horror story into an indictment of the system itself. Among the murders Orlov describes in detail is the death of 9-year-old Nina Zabatina, the very first killing, in 1978. The murder for which Pavel Krivenko was tried, convicted, and executed by firing squad 5 years earlier. Krivenko was innocent. The state had, with its own hand, executed a man for a crime committed by someone still walking free at the time, someone they would later hold, question, and release, all without realizing the connection. There is no version of this story where that fact can be softened. The rush to close a politically inconvenient case cost one innocent man his life, and gave the actual killer 5 additional years, and, by the final count, dozens of additional victims, before anyone came close to stopping him again. Orlov stands trial in a specially built iron cage inside the courtroom, a measure taken less for security than to protect him from the outrage of victims' families packed into the gallery. Proceedings are, by most accounts, chaotic. Orlov himself behaves erratically throughout, at times appearing to perform for the crowd rather than participate in his own defense. Family members of the dead shout from the gallery. Several have to be physically restrained. It is, by any measure, one of the most emotionally raw trials the country has seen. But underneath the spectacle, the trial becomes a genuine reckoning, not just for one man's crimes, but for the layers of institutional failure that let them continue for 12 years. The reflexive need to close cases quickly, the refusal to admit a serial predator could exist within the correct society, the blind trust in a forensic shortcut nobody had bothered to question, and a culture of interrogation that made false confessions almost inevitable whenever the state badly wanted one. He is convicted on the overwhelming majority of the charges brought against him. Some earlier claimed victims cannot be conclusively tied to him and are set aside by the court, a reminder that even in a case this documented, the record remains imperfect. Grigor Orlov is executed in the mid-1990s, in a country that, by then, technically no longer exists in the form it did when his crimes began. The Soviet Union that insisted men like him could not happen under socialism collapsed only a year after his conviction, for entirely unrelated reasons. But the irony is not lost on the investigators who spent over a decade fighting institutional denial as hard as they fought the killer himself. Novikov, the forensic analyst who first connected the killings and who spent years chasing a man his own methods had wrongly cleared, remained haunted by the case for the rest of his career. Colonel Rudenko would later say publicly that the earlier wrongful execution was the single greatest failure of his professional life. Not because his department pulled the trigger, but because it let political convenience substitute for evidence and never went back to check its own certainty. Pavel Krivenko's family never received a formal, meaningful acknowledgement of what the state had taken from them. His name survives today mostly in footnotes to a much more famous killer's story, which is, in its own quiet way, its own second injustice. No memorial marks his name. No official file was ever reopened to clear it. The most complete correction his case ever received was a single line buried in Orlov's own confession, admitting to a murder that had already, on paper, been solved by someone else's death. The case would go on to reshape how the country trained its investigators. Psychological profiling, previously dismissed as an unreliable foreign import, became a standard tool almost overnight. Forensic labs revisited assumptions about secretor status that had, in this case, cost years and lives. None of it undid what had already happened. It simply meant the next version of this story, somewhere else, might end faster. What makes this case endure, decades later, isn't only the scale of the violence, though that alone would be staggering. It's the shape of the failure around it. A system that needed, ideologically, for this kind of monster not to exist, and so built every incentive to close the file rather than open the investigation. A forensic method trusted completely right up until it was proven capable of clearing the actual killer. A confession beaten out of an innocent man because an innocent man was easier to produce than the truth. The real terror of this story was never really about one man's 12 years of violence. It's about how many separate systems, legal, forensic, political, had to fail quietly and repeatedly to let those 12 years happen at all. Somewhere in an unmarked grave is a man who never touched a single one of these victims, executed to satisfy a deadline no one now remembers setting. Somewhere in an archive are 52 case files that took 12 years, 4 investigators' careers, and 1 collapsing empire to finally close. And somewhere in the ordinary, unremarkable version of a man, the neighbor, the grandfather, the party member nobody suspected, is the uncomfortable reminder at the center of every case like this one. The monster was never hiding. He was simply never looked at twice.